You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. It's not the middle of winter anymore.
Yeah, thanks, but it's not yet spring.
No, and I can't remember if the groundhog saw a shadow or didn't.
He did.
Oh.
He saw a shadow.
Which means winter's longer.
That's what they say.
I've never really believed in that stuff anyways. But anyhow, today's subject's an interesting one, and it's interesting because we were just talking about this, but it's moldy food and mold toxicity. How often do you think, for our listeners or those that experience mold toxicity, how often do you think it's only because of food?
Oh, very rarely.
Okay.
Yeah. Our bodies are built to, even when we ingest things that aren't good, like expel it quickly.
Right. And interestingly enough, I actually agree with that. I know there's a lot of probably our listeners that wouldn't. But on the other hand, I've asked, I can't remember which doctor I've asked, but they said, yeah, it can have an impact, but for somebody to think that they live in a healthy home, but the food they ate is what's making them sick is not very likely.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
But it's something that's also in people's faces, right? Every time you but you're about to make toast. Mm-hmm. And then you look and you're like, one piece of toast has this green mold on it. And then you have to ask yourself, do I throw away the whole thing? Or, I think it's something, or an orange or a lemon.
Right.
Something that, oftentimes with food, we don't realize that it's moldy until we've let the food sit there for a long time.
Yeah, and another thing about that, once again, I have no research, I have no education in this to back up what I'm going to say, but it's just an opinion. Those foods, the molds that it would produce, are not from like building materials that we're putting in our homes in 2025. Does that make sense? So you don't have all those chemicals, well, you shouldn't. You don't have all those chemicals and harmful things to humans in an orange like you would on mold growing on sheetrock. Make sense?
That's true. But then if somebody is living in an already moldy home, does that moldy food add to the dynamic?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And I want to be very clear with our listeners. I'm not saying moldy food cannot make you sick. I just think it's an important subject to talk about for those that believe their home is safe and it's the food that's making them sick. Does that make sense? It's easy to...
It does, but let me ask you, especially because the price of eggs right now is through the roof, as are most foods. I was raised by a mother who would see moldy bread and she'd just cut off the piece of the slice of bread that had the mold and keep it moving. Should people do that? I don't do that, but I'm just saying I grew up with somebody who, was like, it's fine.
Well, it's the same principle of if you had a mold infestation in your house, Do you just cut that little section out and think the rest of the home is good?
No, certainly not.
So it's the same concept. This is, once again, just my opinion. But obviously, in whatever, probably a plastic bag, I'm sure some of our listeners could correct me on this, but as long as I've been alive, I'm pretty sure bread comes in a plastic bag.
Correct.
So everything in there's somewhat contained. The ironic part is if you open that bag or the bag was torn, that would allow enough ventilation that mold shouldn't grow. So interestingly enough, my whole point is that little piece of mold that it was on the piece of bread your mom had, my point is the whole bag is probably contaminated, just like a whole home is contaminated when there's mold problems.
So then I'm going to take you down a deeper rabbit hole. You have a bag of lemons, and lemons, like oranges, have that really hard, rigid outer layer. And one of the lemons in the bag of 8 lemons is green with mold, but then like the mold is sort of rubbed off on the other lemons, but some people would say that hard outer layer of the other lemons, you just wash it and it protects the other ones. Is that true?
I have no education or factual basis to base that on. But on the other hand, like in theory, it sounds somewhat okay. But on the other hand, why just go buy new lemons?
So you're saying when in doubt, throw it out.
Yeah. And that's what we've said in previous podcasts. But, the rind on the lemon...
It's still porous, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say technically, and once again, this is not my expertise, but we deal with this when we're talking about, should I throw my couch out? Should we throw my mattress out? Should we throw my TV out? We look at how porous certain things are. So when we're talking about a lemon in the rind, I would say that is a semi-porous surface, but it would take a lot, in my opinion, for that mold to get into the actual part of the lemon that you're going to use. But the other question that it does bring up is when we talk about mold, yes, mold is the concern because it produces the mycotoxins, but the mycotoxins are what really make you sick. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
So I guess what I'm saying is if a client or listener was to ask me, hey, Steve, so do you believe in that bag of lemons that the mold that was grown on that lemon was a toxigenic mold, so it created and released the mycotoxins? I would say I have no way of knowing that. We would have to do a case study. So any of our scientific listeners out there, if you want a case study, do this case study. You would have to do the case study to see if it is a toxigenic mold species. I don't believe it would be. Does that make sense?
And you're also saying when in doubt, throw it out.
Exactly.
Because peace of mind is priceless.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to compare it to the home is it's very similar, and we've talked about it, we'll talk about it again. People always ask, do I have to get rid of everything in my home? Well, when in doubt, throw it out. And that's why you hear IEPs like myself say that. Like, if you're that concerned and you're that sensitive, you should probably throw it out.
How often I know you talk a lot about doing a fall and spring checklist. One thing that I notice is not in either of those checklists is a checking of the pantries, whether it's food or other items. But I do think there are things in pantries that we pretend or forget. We actually forget has been there for months. And the next thing you know, we open up a pantry and, there's brown oozing liquid in places.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is something that literally just happened in the last couple of weeks. But for our listeners, so that they understand what you're talking about, I went into, it was our laundry room. That's where I store our batteries in a container. I went in there because I needed a battery for the mouse on my computer. And as I was pulling the box, it's on a shelf above my head. As I'm pulling the box out, I see all this nasty brown stuff. And I'm like, what in the heck is that? Well, we start cleaning it, taking care of what we got to take care of. I'm not going to tell our listeners what I did or didn't do. That's irrelevant. But originally we thought that it was a battery that exploded. But come to find out, it had dried up, some liquid on the lid of this container that I stored the batteries in. And above it was a 12-pack of beer that was San Francisco 49ers, years and years ago. It was like a special edition type of beer. And as you know, the whole time that we have been together for years, I've had that 12-pack. Well, come to find out, one of the cans in there exploded, and that's what caused it. So to answer your question, you should always do routine inspections, but you've got to inspect places that you normally wouldn't inspect.
Correct. But how often I guess that brings me back to the question, because when people think about mold, they think about a water heater blows, there's a leak in a faucet somewhere, a basement floods. I don't think people think about it like I should look at my pantries every 3 months to make sure that there's there's lots of liquids in pantries in general.
Yeah.
So how often should people be checking things?
Well, the situation we're talking about, it wouldn't have mattered how routine the inspections would have been. It had to have happened within a few days, because there was a bunch of mold on the battery, which is the batteries are in a cardboard thing with plastic on the front. There was mold all over that. Mm-hmm. I guess to answer your question is routine inspections would not have been what would have discovered that. Does that make sense?
It does. So then what do people do if routine inspections wouldn't? I mean, like, how do you just...
Well, at some point, you just have to admit that crap happens. I mean, at the end of the day, it's no different than we had an incident in January with a trailer. Mm-hmm. The whole tire came off, the wheel bearing seized up, and, we were coming back from all day driving in the snow. I could look at that situation and say, okay, this, and this contributed to it. This is what I could have done to prevent it. To do the same thing with what we're talking about in a pantry or in the laundry room. Yeah, that beer that was, and I'm a 49ers fan, so for all you listeners out there, you can laugh at me, but I've been one since I was a kid. I had that because it had some sort of sentimental value, I guess, to me. But to prevent from what happened, I would have had to have thrown that out. So to answer your question, you're in a pantry. You use the pantry. You're in a pantry, I would hope, every day. So you're, for the most part, looking in your pantry. Maybe for our listeners, just inspect up on the top shelves or somewhere where you normally wouldn't be looking.
Absolutely. What about moldy food? I mean, this is where I think habits become really important.
Well, like you said, if your mom had a habit of just cutting the mold out, and that's what she did, and you're both still alive, so I mean, by most terms, people would be like, well, that was fine. I don't agree. But on the other hand, like you said, just throw it out.
Yeah.
Or
store it differently. I guess that's what I'm getting to, because, we have moved away from storing leftover food in plastic. We now store it in glass containers. That's a habit shift.
Right.
So are there habit shifts, especially when it comes to food and mold, should we be taking the bread out of the plastic and putting it in a bread box? Should we be taking the lemons out of the plastic bag? Or no, is that just too much?
Well, I mean, you could, like the lemons, you could. The bread, I'm not sure. I've never taken bread out of the plastic wrap that it's in and put it in a bread box, but I don't think it would stay moist. It would dry out. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about limes or lemons or avocados or whatever, those things would be fine. So yeah, I agree. Habits have a lot to do with it. But like I said, the main purpose of this podcast is for our listeners to understand mold on food is a concern. And I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it's not a concern, but on the other hand, don't just ignore your home itself and everything that could lead to mold, assuming that you're getting sick because it's in your food.
Absolutely. So priorities.
Exactly.
Prioritize what you're doing about possible mold issues. What can people do to sort of stay ahead of mold concerns?
Well, like we said, routine inspections, documentation. I just did a discovery call, and it was a tenant versus landlord kind of situation. I'm not going to get into any details, but one thing I said to her is document. Well, that's important for even if you're not a renter. Make sure you keep documentation. Humidity gauges, those are probably the cheapest pieces of equipment or tools that you can buy, whether you're a renter or a homeowner. And then, like I said, we already talked about routine inspections. And in a few weeks, we have our spring checklist coming up. So for our listeners, we'll be going over that too.
Awesome. So what's your call to action for people?
Do the inspections that we talked about, but go and inspect not your pantry that you're in every day. You can inspect that, but look in areas you normally wouldn't. But go inspect places like your attic, your crawl space, around your water heater, areas you don't go into very often.
Absolutely.
So we appreciate all you listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.